I never thought my life would take such a turn. My name is Clara, and I've spent most of my adult years trying to keep everything in my life perfectly aligned. I had a decent job, a small circle of friends, and a family that, while not perfect, was enough to keep me grounded. But none of that prepared me for what happened when my cousin's son, Ethan, came to stay with me. Ethan wasn't a child anymore. At 23, he was tall, confident, and carried an air of maturity that belied his age. He had just finished his degree and was looking for a place to stay while starting his first job in the city. My cousin Murray had asked if he could stay with me for a few months until he got on his feet. I didn't hesitate to say yes. After all, Ethan was family, and I thought it would be nice to have someone around the house. The day he arrived, I was struck by how much he had changed. The last time I saw him, he was a lanky teenager with an awkward smile. Now he was a man, broad shoulders, sharp jawline, and a quiet confidence that made it hard not to notice him. "Clara, thank you so much for letting me crash here," he said as he stepped into my apartment, his voice warm and genuine. "It's no problem at all," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. "Make yourself at home. The guest room is all set up for you." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I owe you one. I promise I won't be any trouble." The first few days were easy. Ethan was polite, helpful, and surprisingly neat. He helped with the dishes, offered to cook dinner a few times, and even fixed a leaky faucet in the bathroom that I had been meaning to call a plumber for. It was nice having someone around, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations after work. We talked about everything: his plans for the future, my job, books we'd read, movies we loved. There was an ease between us that I hadn't expected, and I started to feel a connection that went beyond the usual family bond. One evening after dinner, we were sitting on the couch, a bottle of wine between us. I had just told him a story about an embarrassing moment at work, and he was laughing, his head thrown back in genuine amusement. "You're too hard on yourself, Clara," he said, his laughter fading into a warm smile. "You're incredible, you know that?" I felt a blush creep up my neck. "Oh, stop it. You're just saying that because I let you live here rent-free." He shook his head, his expression suddenly serious. "No, I mean it. You've done so much for me, and you don't even realize how amazing you are." There was something in his tone, something that made my heart skip a beat. I quickly looked away, pretending to focus on my glass of wine. "Thank you, Ethan," I said softly, unsure of how to respond. The moment passed, but the air between us felt different. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just reading too much into a simple compliment. But as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't ignore the way he looked at me, the way his hand would linger a little too long when he passed me something, the way his voice softened when he said my name. One night, I came home late from work, exhausted and frustrated after a long meeting that had gone nowhere. Ethan was in the kitchen cooking dinner. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the apartment, and I felt a wave of gratitude for his thoughtfulness. "Rough day?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder as I dropped my bag on the counter. "You have no idea," I sighed, kicking off my heels. "Sit down," he said, motioning to the table. "Dinner's almost ready." I sat, watching him move around the kitchen with ease. He was wearing a fitted t-shirt and jeans, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. I caught myself staring and quickly looked away, feeling a rush of guilt. He set a plate of pasta in front of me and sat down across the table. "Tell me about it," he said, his eyes meeting mine. I hesitated, then started venting about my day, the impossible deadlines, the uncooperative colleagues, the general feeling of being unappreciated. He listened intently, nodding and asking questions, his attention never wavering. "You deserve better," he said when I finally finished. "They don't know what they've got." I smiled weakly. "Thanks, Ethan. I needed to hear that." He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. "Anytime," he said, his voice low and steady. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. His hand was warm, his touch firm but gentle. For a moment, neither of us moved. "Ethan," I started, but I didn't know what to say. He pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable. "Sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't." I said quickly, surprising myself with the honesty in my voice. We sat in silence for a few moments, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. I wanted to say something, to break the awkwardness, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, Ethan stood up and started clearing the table. "I'll do the dishes," he said, his tone carefully neutral. I nodded, watching him as he moved to the sink. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite name. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his hand had felt on mine, the look in his eyes when he said I deserved better. I tried to push the thoughts away, to remind myself that he was family, that this was wrong. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted between us, and there was no going back. The days that followed were a blur of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. I tried my best to act normal around Ethan, to pretend that nothing had happened, but it was impossible to ignore the growing tension between us. Every glance, every word, every accidental touch seemed charged with something unspoken. I told myself over and over again that it was just my imagination, that I was reading too much into things. But the way he looked at me, the way his voice softened when we talked, it was undeniable. And worse, I couldn't stop thinking about him. One evening, about a week after that moment at the dinner table, I came home to find Ethan sitting on the couch, a book in his hands. He looked up when I walked in, his face lighting up with a smile that made my heart skip a beat. "Hey," he said, closing the book and setting it aside. "How was work?" "Same as always," I replied, trying to sound casual. "What about you? How's the job hunt going?" He shrugged. "A couple of interviews lined up next week. Fingers crossed." I nodded, dropping my bag by the door and kicking off my shoes. "You'll do great. You're smart, capable. They'd be lucky to have you." "Thanks," he said, his smile softening. "It means a lot coming from you." There it was again, that look. The one that made my stomach flip and my thoughts spiral. I quickly turned away, heading to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of wine. "You want one?" I called over my shoulder. "Sure," he replied, and a moment later, I heard him get up and follow me into the kitchen. I handed him a glass, avoiding his gaze as I took a sip from my own. He leaned against the counter, watching me in that quiet, steady way that always made me feel like he could see right through me. "Clara," he said after a moment, his voice low. I looked up, my heart pounding. "Yeah?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I feel like there's something we need to talk about." I froze, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I can't pretend I don't feel it anymore. And I don't think you can either." My breath caught in my throat. "Ethan, it's complicated." "I know it is," he said, stepping closer. "But that doesn't change the fact that it's real." I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your family. This we can't." "I'm not a kid, Clara," he interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. "I know how I feel. And I think you do too." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was standing so close now that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the faint scent of his cologne. My heart was racing, my thoughts a chaotic mess. "This isn't right," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Then why does it feel like it is?" he countered, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words, the intensity in his eyes, it was too much. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could steady me. "Ethan, please," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't do this." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then finally he sighed. "Okay," he said, his tone resigned. "I'll back off, if that's what you really want." I closed my eyes, relief and something that felt a lot like disappointment washing over me. "Thank you," I said softly. But as I stood there, listening to him walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a mistake. That night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation over and over in my head. I knew I had done the right thing, the responsible thing. But then why did it feel so wrong? The next morning, I avoided Ethan as much as I could. I left for work early, before he was awake, and stayed late, hoping he'd be asleep by the time I got home. But when I finally walked through the door, he was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in his hands. Hey, he said, his voice soft. Hey, I replied, setting my bag down and forcing a smile. You're up late. Couldn't sleep, he said, his eyes meeting mine. You okay? Yeah, I said quickly. Just tired. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Clara, I meant what I said last night. I'll give you space, but I need you to know that I care about you, more than I probably should. I felt my throat tighten. Ethan, You don't have to say anything, he said, cutting me off. I needed you to know. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Thank you, I said softly. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Good night, Clara. Good night, I whispered, watching him walk away. As soon as he was out of sight, I sank into the nearest chair, my head in my hands. I didn't know what to do, what to think. All I knew was that my carefully constructed world was starting to crumble, and I had no idea how to stop it. The next few days were a blur. I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the growing storm inside me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. About the way he looked at me, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room trying to focus on a book I wasn't actually reading, Ethan walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure whether he should stay or go. Do you want to watch something? He asked finally, nodding toward the TV. Sure, I said, setting the book aside. He sat down on the couch, leaving a careful distance between us. He handed me the remote. You pick. I scrolled through the options, barely paying attention to the titles. Finally, I selected a random movie and set the remote down. As the film played, I became increasingly aware of his presence beside me. The way his arm rested on the back of the couch, the way his leg was just a little too close to mine. I tried to focus on the screen, but it was impossible. Halfway through the movie, I felt him shift closer, his arm brushing against mine. My breath hitched and I glanced over at him. He was looking at me, his expression unreadable. Clara, he said softly. Ethan, don't. I can't help it, he said, his voice low. I can't stop thinking about you. I stared at him, my heart pounding. This is wrong, I whispered. Then tell me to leave, he said, his eyes searching mine. If you really don't feel the same way, tell me to go and I will. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was I didn't want him to leave, and that terrified me. I opened my mouth but no words came. I wanted to tell him to leave, to end this before it spiraled further out of control, but the truth lodged itself in my throat like a stone. Ethan's eyes bore into mine, waiting, daring me to say the words that would send him away. But I couldn't. Instead, I stood up abruptly, the motion startling both of us. I can't do this, I said, my voice shaking. I need some air. I grabbed my coat and slipped on my shoes, barely aware of Ethan calling after me as I shut the door behind me. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it wasn't enough to clear my thoughts. My mind was racing, my emotions a tangled mess of guilt, fear, and something I didn't want to name. I walked aimlessly through the quiet streets, the city lights casting long shadows on the pavement. I kept replaying the moment on the couch, the way he had looked at me, the way my heart had betrayed me by wanting him to stay. How had it come to this? Ethan was family, wasn't he? But he wasn't really my nephew. He was my cousin's son, someone I had barely seen growing up. That didn't make it any less wrong, though, did it? I stopped in front of a small park, the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze breaking the silence. I sat down on a bench, burying my face in my hands. I had always prided myself on being in control, on doing what was right. But now, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from a fall I might not survive. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in my thoughts. Eventually, I heard footsteps approaching, and I looked up to see Ethan standing a few feet away, his hands shoved into his pockets. I'm sorry, he said, his voice quiet. I didn't mean to push you. I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. You didn't. This is on me. He stepped closer, his expression filled with concern. Clara, talk to me, please. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Whatever this is, it's wrong, Ethan. We can't." "Why?" he interrupted, his tone more forceful than I expected. "Because people would judge us? Because it doesn't fit into some societal box? I don't care about any of that. All I care about is how I feel about you. And I know you feel it too." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't. Because he wasn't. "It doesn't matter how I feel," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Some lines aren't meant to be crossed." He sat down on the bench beside me, keeping a careful distance. "Clara, I've spent my whole life doing what other people expected of me. Being the good son, the good student, the good everything. But for once, I want something for myself. And that something is you." I turned to look at him, my heart breaking at the vulnerability in his eyes. "Ethan, you don't understand what you're asking of me." "Maybe I don't," he admitted. "But I know what I feel. And I know that I've never felt this way about anyone before. Not like this." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the way his words made my chest ache. "You're young, Ethan. You don't know what you want yet. Don't do that," he said sharply. "Don't dismiss what I'm feeling just because I'm younger than you. This isn't some passing crush, Clara. This is real." I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. The intensity there was almost too much to bear. "Even if it is, it doesn't change the fact that it's wrong." "Why does it have to be wrong?" he asked, his voice softening. "Who decides that? Isn't it up to us to decide what's right for us?" I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that my head and my heart were at war, and I didn't know which one to listen to. We sat in silence for a long time, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Finally, Ethan stood up, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I won't push you, Clara," he said quietly. "But I'm not going to pretend this doesn't exist. You mean too much to me." He turned and walked away, leaving me alone on the bench. I watched him go, a part of me wanting to call him back, to tell him that I felt the same way. But I didn't. When I finally made my way back to the apartment, the lights were off, and Ethan's door was closed. I stood outside his room for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Instead, I went to my own room, closing the door behind me and sinking onto the bed. I felt like I was being torn in two, caught between what I wanted and what I knew was right. The next morning, Ethan was already gone by the time I got up. He had left a note on the kitchen counter, telling me he had an early interview and wouldn't be back until late. I stared at the note for a long time, my emotions swirling like a storm. The day dragged on, every minute feeling like an hour. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't stop thinking about Ethan and the way he had looked at me last night. By the time I got home, I was emotionally drained. Ethan still wasn't back, and the apartment felt emptier than it ever had before. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen. When the front door finally opened, and Ethan walked in, I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. He looked tired, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. "Hey," he said, his voice subdued. "Hey," I replied, setting my cup down. "How was the interview?" "Good, I think," he said, dropping his bag by the door. "They said they'd call me in a few days." "That's great," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me, as if he was trying to read my thoughts. "Clara, about last night." "Ethan, don't," I said quickly, cutting him off. Let's not talk about it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. If that's what you want." "It is," I said, though the words felt like a lie. He nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Okay." He turned and walked toward his room, and I felt a pang of guilt as I watched him go. I wanted to call him back, to tell him that I didn't mean it, but I couldn't. Instead, I sat there, staring at the closed door, wondering how long I could keep this up before everything came crashing down. The days stretched into weeks, and Ethan and I fell into an uneasy rhythm. We spoke only when necessary, our conversations polite but distant. The easy camaraderie we'd once shared was gone, replaced by a tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. I missed him. I missed the way he made me laugh, the way he seemed to understand me in a way no one else ever had. But I told myself this was for the best. The distance would help us both move on. Help us forget about whatever it was that had sparked between us. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. One Friday evening, I came home to find Ethan sitting on the couch, a beer in his hand. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before he looked away. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "Hey," I replied, setting my bag down. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the opposite end of the couch. The silence between us was heavy, and I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye. "How was work?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. "Busy," I said, shrugging. "Yours?" "Same," he said, taking a sip of his beer. I nodded, fiddling with the hem of my shirt. The tension between us was unbearable, and I wanted nothing more than to say something, anything to break it. But I didn't know how. After a long pause, Ethan spoke again. "Clara, can we talk?" I froze, my heart pounding. "About what?" "You know what," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. I shook my head, standing up abruptly. "Ethan, we've been over this. There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is," he said, standing up as well. "You're avoiding me, and it's killing me. I can't keep living like this, pretending everything's fine when it's not." I turned to face him, my emotions boiling over. "What do you want me to say, Ethan? That I feel the same way? That I think about you all the time? That I hate myself for wanting something I know I can't have?" He stared at me, his expression a mix of shock and something else, something I couldn't quite name. "Clara." "No," I said, cutting him off. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to make me feel like this and then act like it's okay. It's not okay, Ethan. It's wrong." "Why?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Why is it wrong? Because other people might not understand? Because it doesn't fit into some stupid idea of what's acceptable? I don't care about any of that, Clara. All I care about is you." I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. "You don't understand. You're young, Ethan. You don't know what you want." "Stop saying that," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Stop acting like I'm some clueless kid who doesn't know his own feelings. I know what I want, Clara. I want you." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I felt my resolve crumbling, the walls I had built around myself starting to crack. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, his eyes locked onto mine. "Tell me you don't feel the same way," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "Look me in the eye and tell me you don't want this." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I couldn't lie to him. Not about this. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my hands trembling as I reached up to touch his face. His eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't pull away. "Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Before I could second-guess myself, I leaned in, pressing my lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, both of us unsure, but it quickly deepened. Years of pent-up emotions spilling out all at once. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. "This doesn't change anything," I said, my voice shaky. "It changes everything," he replied, his tone resolute. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't, because deep down I knew he was right. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. We tried to keep things as normal as possible, but it was impossible to ignore the shift between us. Every glance, every touch, every shared moment felt charged with something new and undeniable. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Ethan reached over and took my hand. I tensed for a moment, but then I relaxed, letting my fingers intertwine with his. "This is crazy," I said softly, not looking at him. "Maybe," he said, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "But it feels right." I didn't respond because I didn't know how. All I knew was that, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. But as much as I wanted to believe that we could make this work, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind telling me that this was a mistake. One night, as we lay in bed together, Ethan turned to me, his expression serious. "Clara, what are we doing?" I sighed, staring up at the ceiling. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't want to hide," he said, his voice firm. "I don't want to pretend this isn't real." I turned to look at him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his eyes. Ethan, this isn't just about us. There are other people to think about. My family, your family, what would they say? I don't care what they say, he said, his tone resolute. This is our life, Clara, not theirs. I wanted to believe him, to believe that we could make this work. But the fear of what might happen if we were found out was too much to ignore. I need time, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression softening. Take all the time you need, he said. I'm not going anywhere. As I lay there, listening to the sound of his breathing, I couldn't help but wonder if I was making the biggest mistake of my life, or if I was finally allowing myself to be happy. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. We tried to keep our relationship a secret, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The stolen glances, the subtle touches, the way we couldn't seem to stay away from each other. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed. One evening as we sat at the dinner table, Ethan reached across and took my hand. I froze, glancing toward the door as if someone might walk in at any moment. Relax, he said, his voice soft. It's just us. I nodded, but the knot in my stomach didn't go away. Clara, he said, his tone serious. I meant what I said. I'm not going anywhere. But I need to know that you're with me in this. I looked at him, my heart pounding. I'm with you, I said finally, my voice trembling. His face broke into a smile, and for a moment, I felt like everything might actually be okay. But deep down, I knew that the hardest part was still to come. I sat there, looking into Ethan's eyes, and it felt like everything in my life was shifting. There was no turning back, no more excuses I could tell myself. All that remained was the truth I couldn't deny. Ethan, I whispered, my voice trembling. We can't keep doing this. He tightened his grip on my hand, his gaze unwavering. Then stop running from it. Face it, Clara. You know how I feel. And I know you feel the same. I looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. It's not that simple. Life isn't that simple. It is, he said firmly. We're the ones making it complicated. What we have, it's real. And it's worth fighting for. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly. But the weight of everything, our families, society, my own fear, pressed down on me like an anchor, dragging me deeper into doubt. What if we're wrong? I asked, my voice barely audible. What if this ruins everything? Ethan leaned closer, his voice steady and calm. What if it doesn't? What if this is the one thing in our lives that's actually right? Tears welled up in my eyes and I shook my head. You don't understand. The world doesn't work like that. People will judge us. They'll hate us. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to handle that. Then let me be strong for both of us, he said, his voice softening. Clara, I don't care what anyone else thinks. I care about you. About us. That's all that matters to me. I stared at him, my heart aching with the weight of his words. He meant every single one of them. I could see it in his eyes, feel it in the way he held my hand as if he were afraid to let go. But I was terrified. Terrified of what this would mean. Of what we'd have to face if we chose to be together. Terrified of losing him if it all fell apart. I need time, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, though I could see the disappointment flicker across his face. Take all the time you need, he said quietly. But just know, I'm not going anywhere. His words stayed with me long after he left the room. I sat there in the silence, my thoughts spinning in endless circles. Could I do this? Could I take the leap and risk everything for the chance at happiness? Or would I let my fear win, pushing him away and leaving us both broken? Days turned into weeks. And though Ethan kept his promise to give me space, the tension between us was palpable. Every glance, every accidental touch, every moment we spent in the same room felt charged with the weight of everything left unsaid. One evening as I sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, Ethan walked in. He hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside me, leaving a careful distance between us. Clara, he said softly, breaking the silence. I know I said I'd wait and I meant it. But I need to know, are you ever going to let yourself be happy? Or are you going to keep running from this forever? His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned to him, my eyes brimming with tears. You think this is easy for me? You think I don't want to be with you?
Ido, Ethan.
More than anything. But I'm scared. Scared of what this will do to us, to our families, to everything we've built. I'm scared too, he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. But I'm more scared of losing you. Of spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been if we'd just been brave enough to try. I looked at him, my heart breaking under the weight of his words. He was right. I had spent so much of my life playing it safe, doing what was expected of me, that I had forgotten what it meant to take a chance, to fight for something I truly wanted. I don't know if I'm brave enough, I whispered, my voice trembling. You are, he said, his hand reaching out to cup my face. You're the strongest person I know, and I'll be right here with you, every step of the way. His touch was warm, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I closed my eyes, letting myself lean into him, letting myself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe we could make this work. When I opened my eyes, Ethan was watching me, his expression filled with hope and determination. Say yes, he said softly. Say yes to us. For the first time in weeks, I let myself smile. A small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. Okay, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes. The relief that washed over his face was palpable, and before I could say anything else, he pulled me into his arms, holding me as if he were afraid I might disappear. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to make this work. The road ahead wasn't easy. There were tears, arguments, moments of doubt and fear. But there were also moments of joy, of laughter, of love so deep it took my breath away. We didn't tell anyone at first, choosing to keep our relationship private, as we figured out how to navigate this new reality. But eventually, we knew we couldn't hide forever. The reactions were mixed. Some were shocked, others angry, and a few surprisingly supportive. It wasn't easy, but we faced it together, leaning on each other when the world felt too heavy to bear. And through it all, one thing remained constant: our love. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't always easy, but it was real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Looking back, I don't regret saying yes. Because even though the journey was hard, it led me to a place I never thought I'd find. A place where I could finally be myself, where I could finally be happy. And for that, I would choose Ethan again and again, every single time.